Okay. Good afternoon. I'll be presenting our study today, and I'm going to start with a few definitions. So this work can be positioned within the greater research area of speech under stress, with stress defined as the non-specific response of the body to any demand. Coined by Hans Selye, this concept differs somewhat from our everyday usage of the term stress to refer to mental or bodily tension. Oops. Now I'm going to use the word load in this context to refer to specific demands that an individual responds to. These might be cognitive, like taking an exam, emotional, or physical, like walking or running. Now, such physical activities initiate changes in different systems in the body. So this is the fight or flight response, which aims to mobilize an individual. So you have increased muscle activation, increased heart rate, and increased respiration. And some of these systems are used for speech, particularly the lungs. So it's thought that this competition for the lungs drives changes in speech under physical load. Under other types of load, respiration also increases. So manipulating respiratory drive using physical load is one way to study the links between breathing and speech under stress more generally. So what kind of changes do we see in the voice? To quickly cover a lot of ground, I will mention 3 reviews across different disciplines. The first 2 reviews in forensic linguistics and pathologies, respectively, both focus on psychological load. In both cases, the most widely obtained finding is an increase in fundamental frequency, so people generally speak at a higher pitch. Individual studies did look at further parameters like jitter, shimmer, articulation rate, but the results were inconsistent here. And the third review is more wide-ranging in that it covers diverse types of load. For example, here there are 6 studies on physical load, although the data stems predominantly from biological males. In terms of effects, again, the focus here is on F0. So the main points are that physical load has received less attention in general. An increase in fundamental frequency is the most widely obtained finding, and results for other parameters are inconsistent. And finally, all 3 of these reviews state that analyzing voice quality parameters could be useful for correlates of physical load. So given that load on the body increases muscle activation and respiration, these changes should also affect voice quality. And broadly speaking, voice quality refers to certain perceptual categories like breathy or pressed voice that differ from modal voice. And in the narrow sense, voice quality refers to the behavior of the laryngeal structures. So we could look at glottal source parameters here. And voice quality has received relatively little attention in this context. The 2 studies cited in the review look at open quotient and normalized amplitude quotient, harmonic richness factor. Both found interspeaker differences, but the second and much larger study, there was a trend towards a more breathy voice. So that brings us to our research questions. And what we're interested in looking at is first, does physical load affect glottal source parameters? What kind of glottal source parameters? And if so, are effects seen even with light, everyday types of load, like walking? Second, we're interested in better understanding how physical load may affect phonatory processes. And third, we're interested in individual differences. So to explore this, we conducted an experiment with female German speakers. 39 are analyzed here. And we restricted this study to one biological sex because this can be a confounding factor due to differences in respiratory and exercise physiology. We used a stationary bicycle to generate physical load. In the control condition, speakers simply sat upon the bike. And then there were two load conditions, one defined as light intensity and one as moderate intensity. And these were defined or quantified using % of maximum heart rate. So to calculate these intensity rates, which we did for each speaker individually, we used a standard method in sports science known as the Carbonin formula. And the important thing about this formula is that it uses resting heart rate as a proxy for physical fitness and age, which accounts for age-related decline in function. So the amount of physical load that each participant responds to is comparable, despite differences that may be present in their age or level of fitness. Participants rode a low-noise stationary bike in our lab and wore a head-mounted microphone. And she's also wearing, you can see the black band on her wrist, a heart rate monitor. So this is how we monitored in real time that they were in their target intensity zone. And the speech stimuli were presented on a screen. We use sustained vowels, which are often used in clinical contexts to evaluate voice quality because they're free of coarticulatory effects. The point vowels a, I, u were presented in the carrier phrase sie sagt, or she says, in random order with 3 repetitions per condition, and the vowels were sustained for an average of 2.5 seconds. Only vowel a is analyzed in this study, and we manually delimited each vowel at the second formant, at the appearance and disappearance of the second formant. Then we used a Pratt script to extract a 200 millisecond section, 500 milliseconds after onset, to get an early production sample of the vowel. And we used a fixed point to allow for repeatability and consistency across speakers. We then analyzed these sections using VoiceSauce, estimating F0 with the straight algorithm, and formants using the SNAC sound toolkit. And we then took the average or the mean value for each segment for our statistical analysis. Since voice quality itself is multidimensional, we analyzed a group of glottal source parameters. So we start here with fundamental frequency, which we expected to increase, but the other parameters were more exploratory, and each one is intended to look at different aspects of glottal settings and the related acoustical properties. So just starting with harmonics-to-noise ratio indicates periodicity against aperiodicity. The difference between the first and second harmonics is a measure of spectral tilt, correlated with glottal constriction. H1 may be a correlate of glottal constriction. The difference between the first harmonic and amplitude of first and third formants indicate an increase of noise. And the last value here, strength of excitation, quantifies how abruptly the vocal folds close on each cycle. And we then fitted a linear model for each parameter, and that brings us to the results. So we found significant effects for 8 out of 10 of the parameters. You see box plots for the first 4 here, showing z-scores. And starting with F0 on the left, we see a clear increase, also with light load. For strength of excitation, it's SOE here, we also see an increase suggesting more forceful closure of the vocal folds, maybe greater vocal fold contact. For H1, an increase may indicate greater glottal opening, breathier voice. And a small decrease in H1A3 is probably accounted for by the increasing strength of H1. So all but H1A3 shifted significantly under light load as well. So again, this is meant to be equivalent to brisk walking. In the table, you see the linear mixed effects. And now moving to the remaining 4 parameters, the harmonics-to-noise ratio. Here you see that there's a significant decrease in HNR under load with greater changes in the higher frequency bands. And HNR has been interpreted as an acoustic correlate of both breathiness and roughness. Breathiness would be aligned with the higher respiratory driving force. roughness would be aligned with this higher strength of excitation, more forceful close of the vocal folds. So altogether, these results sort of underscore that there are multiple cues for load and for breathiness, perhaps. But the strongest effects in light load were observed for fundamental frequency and harmonics to noise in the 0 to 3500 hertz range, clearly. So moving on to individual differences, we'll just look at fundamental frequency. And here you see a line graph showing all speakers, the raw values for F0 on the y-axis. So you see the baseline differences. And the conditions are at the bottom in black. You see the speakers that had a mostly linear increase across the conditions with increasing load. This is the group trend. Then we have 10 speakers, or about 1/4 of our sample, who show no appreciable difference between the control and the light load conditions, but generally an increase with moderate activity. And finally, we have 3 speakers who showed a sharp decrease in fundamental frequency with light load. 2 of these show no real difference between control and moderate load. So this is the opposite of the group trend. And even though this is a rough grouping, it illustrates different possible responses and their distribution in our sample. So how do we make sense of this? Coming back to our first research question, which glottal source parameters change? Well, the ones that we looked at, most of them do. There are significant effects, though the largest effects are still clearly in fundamental frequency and harmonics to noise ratio in the upper frequency bands. And so these may be the most useful acoustic correlates of physical load. Regarding our second question about changes in phonatory processes, it's quite challenging to interpret the changes in this group of parameters and what they might mean. For example, higher F0 may suggest a range of things. You see that in the green box. And this goes hand in hand with the next point, which is that there are considerable between speaker differences and even opposite effects. So we may need to rethink our line of questioning here. So not what are the acoustic correlates of physical load, but what are possible acoustic correlates? What are possible responses of different speakers? And the larger point is that speech under load may not be neutral speech, or it may not be neutral speech for every speaker. So even light load could affect the speech signal in a way that, for example, make applications less effective, like automatic speech recognition. If there were devoicing, and that moves a bit away from voice quality, but or it might compromise the interpretation of results for automatic stress recognition applications. So it might be useful to make sure that potentially load-related variability is accommodated. In conclusion, does physical load affect glottal source parameters? Well, yes. We found significant effects for F0, strength of excitation, H1 and HR. But the greatest effects or greatest shifts were really observed for fundamental frequency and higher harmonics to noise ratio in the upper frequency bands. So this might be the focus for future work. Also, considerable interspeaker differences were found, suggesting that load may be manifested in the voice differently across the population. And in the future, we would like to analyze the other vowels in our data set and compare our results also with spontaneous speech data in the same corpus, where we have some naturally sustained vowels in the form of prolongations, hesitations for these vowels. And we would also like to explore individual differences in more detail, perhaps taking a more of a case study approach rather than significance testing for a group. And finally, as you may have guessed from my mentioning of respiratory processes, we recorded respiratory data as well. And so ultimately, we would like to explore how changes in the breath cycle affect F0 and other features of speech under load. So, thank you.
Are there any questions from the room? Please.
Thank you. It's a slightly trivial question, but I was just wondering whether your participants performed comparably or just sit in the bike doing nothing at all. Because that would give us a sense as to whether the Carvonen formula is actually, normalizing for the speaker differences.
As in why they sat on the bike?
Yeah, so like when you just sit in the bike, do they actually, and you'd compare the data, for that, was it sort of comparable across speakers, or did you find?
The heart rate data. Yeah, so the reason that they sat on the bike is because we recorded respiratory data using respiratory inductance plethysmography, where you have a band around the rib cage and the abdomen, and we wanted them in the same posture in all conditions because that can affect the signal. But that's a really good question. I have not looked at that data. In general, the heart rate, it definitely goes up. So
some people, just the act of sitting on the bike, I think, is quite an effort.
It is, and you see it. So I have the resting heart rate, and you see when it's interesting because we think sitting is not such a big deal, but they do go up. So if resting is at around 60, they're at around 80. I could check my own, maybe many of us as well. So that's a good idea to just look at that.
And see whether that sort of affected the sort of productions you got, particularly the pitch, I would want. Yeah.
At the control, yeah, that's a really good idea. Thank you.
Other questions? Uri, or is it Gerard again? You keep confusing me.
So nice talk. I was wondering why you choose a final position for your target phone, because we expect, in fact, this position to be subject on, variance in intonation. For example, when you have these three subjects at the end, which are rising again, perhaps it's just because they are just bothering about your task and they are just complaining. So since you have this carrier sentence, which is always the same, it could be interesting to compare what you get at the final position with the mean, in fact, the register of this carrier sentence.
So we looked at the stimuli was sie sagt A.
Yeah.
And then
est-ce que tu as dit A? Est-ce que tu as dit I? Est-ce que tu as dit U? And most of the time, when I was young, we try to avoid this final position because if you want to get some kind of
I see what you mean. I see what you mean, and it's interesting because a lot of the sustained vowel research that I was familiar with just uses the sustained vowel. So say
yes, but we say, did you say "ah"? Isn't it? Or this kind of stuff. So you don't finish the sentence only with this target.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. We wanted to get them to have more speech-like intonation, so we trained them that it was really sie sagt "ah," that they held a steady vowel, but I see that what you mean.
You can have people, just getting worried or after the end, because how many tries do you have in total?
It was a long experiment. There are 9. They have 9 vowels per condition. So you're saying.
So try to see also what is happening to the carrier sentence as an average, at 0, at least for 0.
So if that's affecting their I will try. That's also a good suggestion. We wanted to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and look at voiced fricatives and what happens. Sie sagt. So what happens to them under load? But
sure.
It's a valid point. Thank you for that suggestion.
I also have more of just a comment inspired by Professor, that one of those things you were looking at those trends between them being in the sort of resting position, as it were, no load and then other load. And from our own sort of experience with recording the Lombard speech in the loud environment, people tend not to perform completely consistently in these sort of loaded or loud conditions compared to when they are sort of in the quiet, because that's a sort of experimental condition. You put them there on the bike and send them, say naturally, these are, so then they just say something, doing some lap speech, as it were. But actually, including any type of a noise, then any type of the noise,
Lombard speech,
then sort of maybe sort of those quiet conditions might be not very representative. They might be sort of lap speech that people don't know exactly what they are supposed to say. They might be hyper-articulated because they are researchers going to be looking at that speech and all that. So this is just sort of experience. It might be something
to sort of take the values with a grain of salt, then, or do you?
Yeah. So like in Lombard speech, usually when you start increasing the loudness, the people sort of achieve some sort of trend, which is quite interpretable. But that trend does not extrapolate very well to the zero, to the no noise condition, because that's sort of rather arbitrary. Then people, might be not nervous or something like that. This physiological sort of mechanism don't kick in at that stage. So I would sort of take with a pinch of salt exactly those sort of resting positions, and those trends under different strain condition might be more representative.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think time's up. Thanks, Heather, and thanks to everybody for their questions and attention.